Hello and welcome. I would like to welcome you all to this important session today. This session will address COVID impacts on student transitions, enrollment, and learning. I'm Claus von Zastrow, a principal with Education Commission of the States, and I'm delighted to be joining you all today for this very important conversation, and we're very privileged to have two leading experts to address these important issues. As many of you know, the global pandemic abruptly shifted how education leaders and practitioners design and deliver post-secondary education. Things like virtual teaching, amended coursework, and remote student engagement have all had significant effects on enrollment and learning. And so as the field moves to meet these challenging needs of currently enrolled students, and I would say probably faster than it ever has had to in the past, it is very important that we understand these long-term effects. Very important questions remain. For example, what are the projected enrollment trends for 2021? What were the unique challenges students will bring with them as a result of the pandemic? And also, how are state systems and institutions responding? Then there is, of course, the broader impact of the pandemic, the appalling loss of life, economic devastation, and psychic damage. This session will bring together experts on policy, state systems, and the response from practitioners to talk about these questions. We're delighted today to be joined by Doctors Jennifer Keup and Landon Pirius, who will help us understand what we've collectively learned over the past year and what we know about traditional post-secondary transitions and the impacts of the COVID pandemic that they've had. So we'll address these lingering questions with a panel discussion. At the end, we'll try to have time for a brief question and answer session. So I just wanted to say that you are all welcome to add things into the chat as you need to, as questions come up, and we'll try to address them at the end. But let me move on now to frame the issue a little bit. You know, many of us consider post-secondary transitions in a fairly traditional way, right? You finish high school, you go to college, and after that, you graduate. But of course, as many of you know, even in the best of times, this can be a challenging pathway. And there are lots of things that can cause disruptions in the pathway, from, you know, lack of financial aid or lack of access to advising or to housing, to name just a few. Now, the pandemic has, of course, exacerbated these challenges. It's exacerbated the disruptions to the pathways and has created very unique challenges for the classes of 2020 and 2021. So what are some of these areas of impact? No, I can't possibly talk about all of them now. There are too many to share, but I will hit some of the sort of big points that I think many of us can agree on. The first of all, there's been a disruption to admissions and enrollment. An estimated 1 million first-time test takers were unable to take the ACT or the SAT this past spring. Secondly, there's been a real disruption to academic readiness of students who enroll in college. Typically between 40 and 60% of entering college students will qualify for developmental education in English, math, or in both. And we can expect that the pandemic will actually make those numbers seem a good deal worse. There's also, of course, disruptions in support for faculty and staff. There are over 4,000 post-secondary institutions that were affected by the pandemic, which has, for staff, caused disruptions like disruptions to training, staff training, you know, disruptions to what they need to do to get tenure, like research or publications or even advising students. And adjunct faculty have been at particular risk. There have also been disruptions to things like experiential or hands-on learning. For example, nationally, 77% of high schoolers currently engage in career and technical education programs. The shift online has really affected their ability to do face-to-face work-based learning, for example, or to establish really strong peer relationships. And of course, there have been disruptions also to student non-academic support, including things like college advising, for example, mental or emotional health, or even things to address food and housing and security. Now, the perverse thing about this pandemic is that the pandemic is actually deepening these problems at the same time that it makes it more difficult for us to address the problems. And I should add that there's one other disruption really that's not on the screen in front of you, and that is the disruption in what we even know is happening. And by that I mean that we right now have had big disruptions to data systems, not only to things like test scores for students coming out of secondary school, but also to all kinds of other data systems that help us understand what's been happening to students who get knocked off of these pathways. And those disruptions to data make it all the more difficult then to address the other challenges. So how are states, systems, and practitioners responding to this? Well, for this, let's turn to the experts. First, I wanted to see if I could pitch this to our expert, Jennifer Keup, who is Executive Director of the National Resource, Executive Director of the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition. And Dr. Keup can give us a practitioner's experience. You see, Jennifer, when I say your title and your organization, I'm unequal to the task, but I've done my best, and so I'm going to pass the baton to you.
It's okay. We definitely need an acronym, but we also need to buy a vowel. Like somehow or another, we can't quite make the words work, you know. But if our colleagues at Akuho-I have turned that into a word, that we really should probably try harder, right? If you could advance the slide, please, Claus, that'd be great. Just to introduce, again, I am Executive Director of the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition. I'm not sure if you want to give a thumbs up or a reaction if you've been to one of our events or familiar with us, that would be great. Many of you, I see some familiar names and faces, but if you could advance to the next slide, a little bit about who we are. This is our mission statement at the top. We support educational professionals in their work to affect any number of students. So while the beneficiaries of our work are the students, our constituency really are educators and advocates on behalf of those students. And we really try to work with those individuals to change the systems of higher education, the way we do things. Really what we're about is we support student success. We just happen to focus on those critical junctures of transition that tend to be leakage points in the educational pipeline historically. Some of them are quite large and very temporally determined. We know what it looks like to leave secondary education and go into tertiary education. We understand, even though it's getting more complex, what a transfer is. You leave one institution and go to another. We get the idea of a culminating experience and leaving with an educational degree at the end of that experience, or even moving from the first year to the second year into a more experienced central position within the institution. And that's really been the backbone of the work we do. But I would say in the past decade, we see a lot more coming under the umbrella of our work with respect to the smaller transitions that are no less important. Major changes, moving from on-campus residence to off-campus residence, student athletes who leave their sport, individual, personal, and developmental transitions in terms of identity development or learning development. So there are myriad forks in the road for students as they journey through the undergraduate experience. And all of those tend to be falling under the work that we do. On the left-hand side of the slide, we have the pleasure of being a values-based organization, and you see our core commitments. I always joke that these are a little bit of our "this I believe" statement. We believe in the power of student transitions as being transformative learning opportunities. We believe, we strongly support the connection between research and practice and purposefully put ourselves in that liminal space to support scholarly practice and applied research. Collaboration and inclusion are critical to the work that we do because student transitions and first year experience work are very horizontal and cross-cutting and have great potential to build bridges across parts of the academy. And we believe that all academics are lifelong learners in some sense or another. I mean, we all get excited about new books and school supplies when they go on sale, right? I mean, that's who we are. On the right-hand side, you will see the ways that the levers we pull to advance this work. They're very typical of most major organizations: professional development, publications, research, and communication and partnerships. One thing that we're different is we are not a membership organization, which means that all of you, welcome, you're members of our network. Basically, we consider our network anybody who is focused on and supports student success. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. The next slide, we were asked to, I just put some things to paper about reflections upon where we've been this past year. And these really are reflections because even though it feels like we've been doing this forever, we're now coming up on a full year from when we evacuated our campuses and went to remote, teaching and learning. It's so soon, we don't quite understand the empirical evidence or the projections we're faced with. So these really are reflections to get our conversation going. One of the critical things that I think was transformative in terms of understanding the issue is the fact that we've often been talking about how we're doing distance learning. We're not. What we're doing is emergency remote teaching and learning. Distance learning is really about this idea of a choice architecture. That is, the student has choice architecture and is intending to go into a distance learning, online learning environment, and the institution has created that intentionally. We were forced into an emergency remote teaching situation, and we have learned from it, and we've certainly drawn from our distance learning literature, but we have to understand really what we've been doing. Crisis response has framed and reframed and raised equity issues that often are at odds with one another. We have seen what I've largely talked about of hidden populations who normally sort of reveal identities in a comfortable, safe environment, but they've had to come out immediately and talk to us about certain things that are more hidden, that students don't have to tell us that they have housing insecurity or food insecurity, that they're on the spectrum, that they have emotional, mental health care needs, that they're LGBTQ+. They don't have to tell us those things until they're ready, until we create a safe environment. And in many instances, those things came out readily and quickly, particularly things like housing insecurity. So when we were clearing out our residence halls, thinking we were doing the best thing, we were faced with issues of students saying, you're sending me into I don't have a place to live. I don't have food. It's not a safe environment. And so we were kind of faced with these things in really interesting ways, as well as the fact that we were faced with really increased divides in the sort of standard set of equity issues we've been facing for a long time. I'll talk more about this later, but the idea of we've had to shift from place to purpose. We can't hide behind, the kinds of amenities that we have on a campus. We have to be really about who we are and knowing our purpose. And this fourth bullet point is one that I took from a tweet, which really spoke to my heart as one of the things that I think everyone's been struggling with, including our students, especially our students, is that what everybody wants is to belong to a community, and we keep putting them in audiences. And that's where really like a lot of pain and disengagement is happening, that we're really missing how we create community in these alternative environments. Pathways and transitions, which are the focus of what we do, are changing. The way students are navigating higher education right now, the choices they're making through admissions, and continuation and progression is very different in this environment. And I think we're going to see repercussions of that for a long time. And I think that the title of the slide is very intentional, with a sense that crisis, uncertainty, and change, that is a cycle, and we have to be careful we don't perseverate in crisis, because we know how to do crisis better than we know how to do change. So we are at a point right now, after a year of this, we're having to look at what we want to take with us into a new normal, and that takes intentionality. It takes moving from a disruptive crisis-based state to intentionally making choices about change and to transformation. So those are the things we see our network talking about at this time, and I appreciate having the chance to put that out there.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And so now let's hear from Landon Pirius, who is Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs at the Colorado Community College System, on how systems and institutions are grappling with these issues. Landon?
Yeah, thank you, Claus. Just sound check, good? Okay, great. Sorry, I've always found I'm on double mute at certain times. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and share a little bit about the Colorado Community College System and some of what we've seen over the past year. And so just want to spend a minute or two about us. And so you understand our scope, our reach, and our students. And so this is a map of the state of Colorado. The yellow dots are each of our campuses. And so we serve about 124,000 students across the state. And if you're not familiar with Colorado, that's pretty much every corner of the state, including a lot of rural institutions and a number of institutions in metro or urban areas. Next slide. So in total, we have 13 institutions, but we have actually 40 locations. And so some are large, some are small. In terms of our credentials, we have a broad swath of credentials that we award, pretty typical to community colleges in the country, with degrees, associate degrees, certificates, badges for shorter term training. But we also have authority to offer bachelor's degrees and even one master's degree in our system. On the non-degree side, we also do a lot of work with apprenticeships, non-credit training, internships, and a number of other experiences that may not lead to a specific credential. And then the next slide. And I'll spend just a little bit more time here. If you are familiar with community colleges, this probably looks pretty similar to your own demographics. If you're not, this might look a little different. But for us in the community college system, first of all, we serve primarily folks from Colorado who reside in Colorado. That's very typical for a community college whose mission is to serve the community that they reside or where they reside. In terms of our demographics, I pulled out just a few, and these are important because they relate or are very relevant to what's happening in the pandemic overall. So 37.5% students of color, majority first generation, and 68% Pell eligible or low income. And if we think about what's happening in the pandemic, whether it's if we're thinking K-12 or if we're thinking food insecurity, loss of job, or we're thinking health access to healthcare, these three groups are also disproportionately negatively impacted by the pandemic in those areas, and it's happening at our community colleges and institutions of higher education as well. So I'll have some comments later on that dig a little deeper into this, but just that's our overall breakout. And I do want to mention the last item, the skills builders. This builds a little bit off of the previous slide where I talk about kind of our breadth of programming. We also have a group of students who are only here for one semester, maybe two, and they're taking one or two classes for the purpose of a promotion or a job change. And we see great wage increases as a result of that experience. But prior to a couple of years ago, we did not measure this student population, and they were essentially considered as failures because they weren't retained, they didn't graduate, they didn't transfer. So I bring it up just to show you the breadth of the student experiences that we have. And as it related to the pandemic, the different types of strategies we had to employ in order to serve the very different types of students that we have at our community colleges. So I'll leave it at that. Klaus, turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Landon. So now we're going to move to the part of this panel where we have a discussion among the panelists where we can dig deeper into some of the questions that both of them have already kind of alluded to so far. And I do want to encourage you again in the audience to enter any questions that you have in the chat, and we will make every effort we can to address those questions in the last 5 minutes or so of this session. So let me begin. I'm going to ask questions really of both of you because it's very hard to say that one of you has a better purchase on one than another does. But let me start with a broad question about what happened towards the beginning of this pandemic, right? So when this was first happening, you found yourselves in this unprecedented crisis. How did practitioners, state leaders respond initially? What kinds of priorities did they have at the beginning?
Thank you, Klaus. I'll jump in really quick. For us, what we were really focused on was one of the bullets that Jennifer had in one of her slides was around emergency remote teaching and learning. And that really was what our focus was on after the immediate concern about health and safety. How do we move our students off of campus or into remote environments, and our staff and other folks, and ensuring that we had met the safety protocols. But then we had to move into this, and this is in a matter of literally a couple of days. We had to shift to emergency remote teaching and learning. And once we made that shift, then it was, how do we help our students finish? Because it was, we were, mid-semester, and we weren't shutting down. We had to make sure our students had actually the ability to finish their classes and to graduate if they were in their last semester. So once we really worked through our health and safety protocols, then we had to figure out how do we help our students finish. Immediately, though, we were also, now what do we do about summer? And really in the summer, we were still thinking, well, maybe we'll be back to normal in the fall. And of course, that didn't happen. But we were thinking, okay, well, we can just get through summer, and then we can kind of get everyone back on campus in the fall. And so we were planning literally semester to semester, week to week, day to day, on technology issues, training issues, scheduling issues, student support issues, and all of that stuff was continuing, certainly in an emergency response short term to get through this into the spring. But then throughout the summer, and really it's continued fall and spring. So I'll just summarize: health and safety first, and then second, how do we help our students meet whatever their educational goal was so that they could fulfill that?
Everything that Landon just said, plus one. I think what was interesting also was the timing of this, right? And it's the fact that this happened in March. Institutions were just either, if they had, the admissions process, they were just sending out notices to the next class. They were managing yield events. They were managing campus visits. And so in the backdrop of the most immediate needs, health, safety, managing infrastructure, getting students the support they needed for continuity of courses, adapting experiential education opportunities into something, that there's nothing more action research than this. I had a first year student as the director of the National Resource Center, the first year experience in college, come home, his March of his freshman year, an engineering major. And I said, how are you going to do your chemistry lab? I don't want that on my kitchen island, right? So how do we continue those kinds of things and provide alternatives? But in the backdrop, there was, how are we building the next class when this is in the environment in which students are having to make their choice? That they can't come on campus, that the things we could, are we going to be able to give them the things that we promised? So that was also going in the background. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this is a cycle. Crisis is a cycle. And the title of that slide that I prepared was really intentional. We went through crisis where we managed everything right away. And that's a huge outpouring of resources. And I mean resources writ large, not just money. I mean time and energy and emotional investment and empathy and all the things. And then, we were going. And then we realized we had no idea how long we're going to be in this. So sometime around summer, we had to immediately shift our perspective into managing uncertainty, which is all about conservation of resources, which is a huge shift personally and institutionally and for system wide. So I always joked, it was like we thought we were running a 5K, and then at the 3-mile mark, people said, no, you don't have 0.1 miles left. You're running a marathon. And that changes how you do things. And you're already tired because you were doing the crisis. And so there was a lot also in terms of understanding the larger cycle, and from a leadership perspective, managing that for our staff, for our students, and for our environments, is how do we manage that shift from an outpouring of energy in crisis to sort of being very cautious about our choices of where we invest energy and resources in the managing uncertainty range.
Thanks very much to both of you. So you've talked about this immediate response to crisis, and then this move to trying to figure out that, living in uncertainty over a much longer period of time than you expected you would. Now, as you think forward, do you see what the impact might be on things like enrollment and learning in 2021, as let's say in fall? I mean, now you've got new kinds of uncertainties. We're still in uncertainty. Do you have any kinds of insights that have taken shape recently about that?
Well, again, I'll start this one. And there's a lot I think we don't know, but there's a lot we've learned, right? So I think that as we're going forward and making choices about what types of environments are we going to go forward with, we've thought about how do we do emergency remote teaching in a better, more intentional way. What tools are we going to keep even when we go back into perhaps an primarily in-person environment? What have we learned that will increase accessibility, that might make our classrooms, more high flex and hybrid than necessarily in person? Or even what have we learned about pedagogy? I think there's some really interesting things. The degree of accessibility with respect to student services and support, advising, counseling services, all those kinds of elements, we've made them more accessible by the fact that we've had to move them into different modalities. And I think some of that is going to stay on. I think that we're seeing really a huge shift in everything from going test optional to the kinds of pathways students are going through. And we still have yet to be seen, but there's some exciting opportunities, I think, towards reinvesting and re-examining tools of equity and access. Unfortunately, I think we're examining those because we're seeing huge setbacks in terms of access and equity, which are forcing us to re-examine our practices for the purposes of that. And then the last thing, I guess, is that what I see is, in some ways, I feel like your question is like, what is there that's hopeful? Where are we going forward? I don't know, maybe I'm reframing that just for my own purposes. But the idea, as I said in the slide, is like we are having to return to the idea of what is our purpose rather than hiding behind, our sense of place. We didn't have that luxury. How are we going to build a community around purpose? How are we going to make difficult decisions about our resources around who we are in the marketplace and what we can offer our students? That's a unique learning experience. And that may be, who we are, or might be who the students that we serve, or what the things that we're able to provide. So there are some things that I see that are coming out of this that are going to either help us examine things or help us move to a new space. And I think we're going to have to really sit with those. So to me, 2021 is now moving out of uncertainty and deciding, what we're going to take with us to the next frame of things. What is going to be the new normal based upon the decisions that we make of taking with us what's good, returning to what's good, and re-examining everything because it's all on the table.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And I'm going to pass it now to you as well, Landon. And you make me sound much more optimistic than I generally am as a person, Jennifer. But Landon, sort of same question to you, especially with this notion of 2021 and the expectations about enrollment and learning.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll focus on those two words, enrollment and learning. I think one of the things that we're seeing that we didn't quite understand in the summer and probably didn't fully understand in the fall. And I go back to your comment at the very beginning, Claus, about that it's one of the things we just don't have the data, we don't have the empirical evidence to really actually understand the impact or what's going to happen. But what we're seeing is we're seeing great disparity in who's showing up. And so I specifically mentioned low income first generation students of color in my intro slides because, one, that's who a lot of our students are, but those are also the students where we're seeing are disproportionately not showing up at our institutions. So for instance, our low income students, we see a 13% decline in low income student enrollment at our colleges, whereas not low income students, it's about 3%. So the gap has gotten bigger. Like it's a very similar with first generation as well. And so we see that in terms of just access, who's coming, we're seeing that those students who identify as students of color, who are low income or who are first generation, are not coming at the rate that they did before. And that's completely understandable because a lot of those students are also facing outside challenges outside of the classroom, whether it be childcare, work, transportation, technology, food insecurity, housing insecurity. All of those things are compounding. And if those are the challenges you're facing outside of the classroom, why would you choose to get into the classroom? And so what we see is not just an immediate, oh, you get a vaccine, you're going to go back to college. Our students in community colleges in particular have to address all of those other challenges before they will even entertain perhaps coming back to college. And so while 2021, we're not expecting enrollment to go up, it might be 2 or 3 years before we see in community college enrollment rebound as a result of the pandemic. In terms of learning, I already mentioned at the end of the spring semester, it was really just how do we finish this up? And what and then when we moved into summer, fall, spring, only about 25% of our classes are truly online. They're designed for online. They're taught by instructors who know how to teach online. They're taken by students who choose to take online courses. So we fully expect that there's going to be a drop in learning or in outcomes if you're looking at outcome assessment. But the other thing we're really worried about is what's coming to us in the future. And in the state of Colorado, Denver, it's a Denver Public Schools, 10% drop in K-12 enrollment, where students just they stopped attending. And I know in the lower grades, like K through 3, there was a very specific choice by families just to keep their students out of school for a year. eventually that's going to hit us, and we just don't know what is the impact of that. If you know, is it a positive, a negative impact? We don't know how, if that'll right itself by the time these students get to college or not. So we're still just trying to wrestle with, well, what does this actually mean by the time our students either come back to us or who were in the earlier pipeline eventually get to us in the future.
Thanks very much, Landon. I want to acknowledge that a couple of questions have come in the chat that have to address that notion of what do we retain from this experience that we carry into the future. I'm going to take those a little bit later because I think that they'll fit nicely towards the end of our conversation here. I wanted first to sort of pick up on something that you had addressed just now, Landon, on the question of sort of equity, given who your, who your students are and what kinds of supports they need and what kinds of barriers they face. I wanted to turn it back to Jennifer. If you could say a bit more about equity issues as they're being framed for you right now in terms of the pandemic, and whether there are certain imperatives that you think we need to address first in that area.
Sure. I mean, equity is always an incredibly complex issue. And I think that we were faced with a lot of those complexities in ways that we, at the same time in the midst of the pandemic. And so one of, certainly we had students who historically been of concern and interest to our environments, low income students, students of color from historically marginalized populations. First generation students tend to be populations of great concern. And, how do we support individuals? We were faced with things like the digital divide in ways we hadn't really faced for a long time because we had been able to tackle that in our environment. But then when students went home into rural environments or places where they didn't have the infrastructure in their homes for it. So we were faced with a lot of these things in very sort of almost aggressive ways in the midst of this. And again, I think we also were faced with a degree of intersectionality of our students and their identities, right? I mean, that no student is just one of those things. They're all those things all the time. And the salience of certain identities come out depending on which time we're facing the conversation, right? So, student is a lot of different things. And identifies with, I do a lot of research on students who are students today. And one of the things we found is this generation of students identify with more identity areas and more strongly with those identity areas than previous generations of students. Meaning if I asked you to, student to say, write a list of the things, who are you? And write a list of those characteristics, the list would be longer than previous generations of students. It would be in all caps, they'd be underlined, there'd be exclamation points after most of them. And that intersectionality was a real challenge, I think, in ways that were difficult, but also led us to really start to acknowledge and accept that intersectionality. Students' identities have always outpaced our ability to categorize them, understand them in really wonderful and sort of messy ways. And this really was a way that we had to deal with that on the spot. The other thing I think is that, we can't discount the fact that there were other things happening in the background, and the pandemic led to other things that had real equity implications. Xenophobia, a student who is, of Asian descent is now dealing with the fact that, this is being called the China virus or something along those lines. And what does that mean for their sense of safety beyond just getting sick, but feeling comfortable in that environment or adjusting or adapting to that environment if they're a new student through transfer or first year student. And then of course, also the backdrop of racial violence that was happening. That has been around forever, but we can't deny the fact that it also was a prevalent theme last year. And so our Black students, colleagues, friends, family members were dealing with that in the midst of all this. And so there's sort of multiple layers, again, of intersectionality of how people were facing the pandemic and how do we keep up with that and how do we address all of those things. We also have to say one of the things that I think was mentioned earlier by Landon that is a great tool for equity is peers, right? Our peer communities on campus, particularly our trained peer leaders, help us a good bit. And a lot of sort of diversity imperatives are managed through peer networks, particularly strategic use of peer leaders and, para-employees, so paraprofessional employees, that was taken away from us. And again, we might see sort of a balkanization of students, as they return to campus until we can go past that. So I think I'm bringing up more problems than solutions, but I feel like if we know what we're looking at, we're much better suited to address it and support students through those challenges.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I think, on the point of bringing up more problems and solutions, it sounds, obviously, both of you have addressed the challenges that you faced as a result of a crisis and that you anticipate ongoing in the wake of that crisis. But I think you've both also alluded to something that our two questioners have alluded to, and that is what kinds of things do you hold on to that you've learned from this crisis that can make things better? Before I get to that latter question, and I will, I want to talk about something in between, which is, what successes do you think you can point to right now? Amidst all the problems and challenges that have arisen, what things can you hold up, do you think, that as successes in how you addressed the crisis of the pandemic?
Well, I'll add just a couple things. It seems kind of silly, but it's, we continued. I mean, it seems odd to say that, but you think about if the pandemic had occurred 20 years ago, there's no way our higher education institutions could have continued in the way that they did. We wouldn't have had continuity of operations. We would have just shut down. And so I think in some sense, that is a success. And I think we need to acknowledge that. Another success, I think, is that we pivoted really fast and continue to pivot from day to day, semester to semester. Some of the things that we implemented are things that might have taken 5 years to do without the forces of the pandemic behind them, in terms of some of the instructional strategies that we've had to employ, some of the technological solutions we're building or making available, or some of the student services that we've been able to make for or provide for our students. And then the other thing I would say, and this is more on the human side, I think that the pandemic, one thing, it wasn't intentional, but I think we were able to start to see students as individuals that have things beyond what they might present in a classroom that impact them. They have a family. I mean, look at these Zoom calls. How many times have you been on a call where a kid walks in or a dog walks in or something happens? And I think we've all had a little bit more sense of being human as a result of that. It's not just the instructor at the front of the room, it's the instructor who has a spouse and 2 kids and a dog and a parakeet. It's all these things. And I think that's a added element that I think has built, perhaps, even though we're more at a distance, perhaps there's been more connection as a result of that. So I like to think that we've gotten to know each other a little bit better and know each other as people, as opposed to, oh, you're just the student in my class, or you're that instructor at the front of the class.
And Jennifer, I'm sorry, I want to make sure we really leave time for these 2 questions at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of start with you in asking those questions. And maybe if we want to, we can also, in the course of talking about our future hope for successes, we can talk about some of them that you've had right now. But
That's great, because I was about to answer Donna's question as part of my answer.
Oh, okay, well, very good. See, I intuited that, as you can probably
yes,
tell.
we're in the same place, Klaus.
But
one of the things I was going to say is,
well, I'm sorry, I did want to ask the question first, because I think it ties nicely with some of the things you've said earlier, Jennifer. So my apologies, but I did want to say that, there are state policies that have been waived during the pandemic. And are some of those state policies, you think policies that need to be revisited even after the pandemic? In other words, do we simply have to go back to normal in the state policy environment, or would we have sort of state agency changes or other legislative changes, policy changes that you think are a good thing that we could retain in the longer term?
I'm going to speak to that very generally, but I feel like Landon lives those, and so maybe he might be the better resource for a state policy question. But I do feel like we've had to, the things we're seeing with respect to test optional admissions, flexibility, some considerations along those lines. We're not quite sure what that's going to mean, because initially it seems we had hoped it would open up more doors, but I think it also, might have closed certain ones. So we need to see those through and understand what they mean. I think we're making some assumptions about what they mean in terms of equity and access, but our initial returns are showing, like Landon said, much lower investment and involvement of students from certain backgrounds. And that may be circumstantial because of the pandemic, and we may not have really fully tested it yet. So there's that. I'm going to give a really quick answer to Donna's question, which one of the things I'm really pleased about seeing for the future is this idea of innovation, and particularly in classrooms, right? I also really love the idea of us returning to a sense of purpose, who we are as an institution, what we do, but this innovation in terms of pedagogy, the idea that faculty who are going to do nothing but lecture, which is a really bad thing because we're lecturing at you all, but it's a bad example. But in a classroom, the students are falling asleep or they don't show up, but you have to do something different in a distance learning environment. And even though we started off as emergency remote teaching, pedagogies like engaging students, shorter bites of information, types of interactions, and the training we see built up around that, and teaching and Centers for Teaching Excellence and Teaching and Learning, I think are very exciting, and I see that going forward. So in terms of the idea of pedagogy and how that has shifted, I think that will come into the classroom in terms of those tools, especially technology tools. So it's a very short answer to your question. That's what I'm most excited about in terms of things that will go with us. So I'm going to bump that policy question to you, Landon, because I think this is probably like, you wake up and eat this question for breakfast. So
I actually prefer the latter question to the policy question. I like focusing on the humanness. Not that policies don't touch humans. I don't mean it that way. But the test optional is a great example. That is legislation coming through the state of Colorado at the moment. At a local level, we have grading policies that pass fail grading options, incomplete deadlines. A lot of these sorts of things that we think are really important. But we also have some structures that we're trying to put in place to better serve our rural community colleges in the future in terms of connecting them and actually utilizing this type of technology to share instruction and share student services across our rural colleges. And that's a policy and a fiscal piece that we're trying to put in place, and the pandemic has accelerated that. So we're very excited about the ability to ensure rural sustainability, rural viability in the future, so that those colleges are able to continue to serve their students and their communities. So those are some policy things that we're working on that we think that, again, the pandemic accelerated, but that will hopefully stay on and continue whatever the new normal will be.
Well, I want to thank you both very much. I know we've gone just a shade over time here, but I think, Dr. Keup, Dr. Pirius, this was really very, very illuminating, and I'm delighted that we could have you here for this conversation. So thanks to you, thanks to all of our audience members as